Well, I feel extremely honored to have been invited to speak tonight, and I must say I'm very nervous, probably more nervous than I've been in years. It's been very challenging trying to sort out what to say to such an audience that includes mentors, peers, and newer generations as well. And quite a lot has been said already, and it's been very interesting, I think, to hear how the stories that various people have told over the weekend both intersect and distinguish themselves across the decades. Even with serious reflection, I think it's difficult to ascertain what has contributed to one's successes, failures, decisions, and actions. Given that the psychology of gender is now my academic home, it's perhaps only fitting that I use a gendered lens to reflect on what my education at Carleton has meant. This is, of course, also an opportunity to explicitly recognize those who, my ruminations suggest, enabled me to have an academic career and shaped its direction. My story is on the one hand personal, but it is also the story of a particular time in Canadian history, when multiple social movements had effected changes in our collective consciousness about race and gender, at least to the point where we took it for granted that overt discrimination on the basis of race or gender is wrong. There had been also a growth in the number of universities in Canada, and those universities were welcoming anyone who had a high school diploma, a satisfactory academic record, and the financial resources to cover their expenses. Graduating from high school in 1970 with a respectable but not outstanding transcript, I consider myself lucky to have pursued university studies. Although my parents were supportive of my going to university, they did not have the knowledge or experience to offer much practical assistance. My mother had completed high school, a matter of some pride and truly an accomplishment given the challenging lives of immigrant families who homesteaded in southern Saskatchewan. She also received further education in office work, refusing to follow her father's wishes that she attend normal school and become a teacher, which at the time would have been more acceptable work for a woman. My mother's stories of resistance to the expectations related to being a woman showed me the possibility of not following the normative path for women. Indeed, when I started my university studies, I knew more certainly what I did not want to do, become a teacher, a social worker, or a secretary, than what I did want. And I don't mean to disparage those occupations, but at the time, of course, those were the three things that women could do. My father did not attend high school and instead went to work at a young age. By the time I was born, coincidentally, in the same year that the Department of Psychology at Carleton University was formed, my father was an auto mechanic, but also seemingly able to do almost anything practical, from carpentry to plumbing to electrical work and farming. As the oldest in my family, I became the first, and in the end, only child to attend university. Coincidentally, the year I began my undergraduate studies was the year that Virginia Douglas became the second woman president of the Canadian Psychological Association. Mary Wright had preceded her in 1968 to 1969. But after Virginia Douglas, there was not to be another woman president until the 1980s. Lest you think that women's dominion in psychology was clearly on the rise, however, CPA was no feminist organization. 1972 was the year of the infamous Underground Symposium, when a group of feminist psychologists from York University organized a clandestine symposium of their own across the street from the CPA Convention Hotel. They did this because all of their papers, which dealt with topics like sex stereotypes in children's literature and fear of success, had been rejected, and the Convention Hotel refused to rent them a room when CPA put pressure on the hotel. The symposium proved to be a great success, with standing room only and considerable media attention. Things went somewhat better at subsequent conferences, and in time, the section on women in psychology was formed. As an undergraduate student at the University of Calgary, I was blissfully unaware of such developments. I had no intellectual or practical interest in feminism at the time. I did, however, have my mother's stories of denial of opportunities and discrimination. They even included one story that I only later realized constituted attempted rape. I also had a strong orientation away from feminine pursuits and the soft side of psychology. My experience at the University of Calgary did not disappoint. I avoided areas like social and developmental psychology that historically were the preference of women in psychology and were seen as suited to the feminine psyche. You might say that I embodied androgyny without having heard the term. I preferred courses on statistics, research methods, physiological psychology, even though I received a rather nasty rat bite when I volunteered at the open house, and of course, cognitive psychology, which at the time was a new area, reintroducing topics like consciousness to psychology. It was also a very male environment. Only 2 regular faculty members were women, and when I was appointed assistant professor in 1982, that made 3 of us. Out of interest, I looked at the faculty lineup for Carleton in 1970 and noted a similar pattern of gender representation. Of the 25 faculty members, 3 were women: Nan Donald, Marilyn Marshall, and Eleanor Burwell. Joe Tombaugh at that time was a sessional instructor. By the time I arrived at Carleton in 1975, there were 40 faculty members. The same 3 women, but Joe Tombaugh was now an assistant professor. Returning to my story, I excelled academically, graduating with a perfectly GPA of 4 in the final year of my honors program. Clearly, the male environment was not an impediment to my academic success. Although my professors encouraged me to apply to graduate school, that was one step I simply could not manage to prepare for in my final year of the honors program. So I sought a full-time clerical job. I was an excellent typist, having distinguished myself at secretarial summer school, a strategic decision that enabled me to support myself through university. I became a junior secretary in the philosophy department. After 4 months of reading novels and typing articles and book chapters and manuscripts on topics like the nature of personhood, I realized that I was not yet done with academic life. I had doubts about my abilities. I was especially afraid of public speaking, which is kind of coming back to me tonight, I'm afraid. But my then husband, who was a computer scientist, wanted to go to graduate school, so we applied together. And Carleton University not only accepted us both, but was near the top of our list of places where we most wanted to study. If I'm honest with myself, I don't know whether I would have had the courage to move to Ottawa to attend graduate school on my own. I had never been west of Regina. I came from humble beginnings, had minimal travel experience, and limited financial resources. But I made the journey and began graduate studies in September 1975. My supervisor initially was Peter McCormick, who we heard about this morning, and I was supposed to research the topic of bilingual memory. Our supervisor-student relationship did not last for more than a few months, however, because Peter was not well, and I worried how this might affect my education. I remember him as a kind man, and it was a difficult decision for me to take action. As luck would have it, my office was close to the office of a recently arrived assistant professor, Nick Spanos. He kept graduate student hours, and so we often fell into conversation. Really, just conversation. He seemed rather exotic, given his interest in hypnosis, and at some point I must have mentioned my predicament and my desire to change supervisors. Nick proposed that I work with him, and we discussed how my interest in memory and cognition might fit within his overall research program. A project on hypnotic amnesia clearly fit the bill. Somehow the supervisor change was made officially, and probably one of the most difficult tasks I've ever had was to meet with Peter and tell him what I was going to do. The cover story focused on a change of research interests, and he accepted the change graciously. But it must have been, I realize now, a bit complicated for the department, though, as I was funded through Peter's research grant, which then would be supporting someone else's graduate student. Somehow, though, the adults took charge, and I carried on with my plans to do a thesis on hypnotic amnesia. Fortunately, I was awarded an NSERC graduate scholarship for my second year of graduate studies. A few memories of my years at Carleton that stand out for me include initially the graduate stats course taught by Jo Tombaugh. I'm sorry she can't be here tonight. She was an excellent instructor, and I achieved sufficiently in that course to become the teaching assistant in subsequent years, enabling me to deepen my understanding. This also proved, I think, to be my ticket to my first academic position, a one-year appointment at the University of Manitoba, where I mainly taught graduate statistics. It was also, I think, a point in my favor when I was hired a year later by the University of Calgary. In my first year, I taught graduate-level multivariate statistics and undergraduate-level experimental psychology, which included research design and statistics. This was my teaching focus for the first 5 years of my career there. The history course I took with Brian Laver was also to prove significant in several ways. The topic was the history of ideas, and the seminar involved discussion of this new way of doing history. The other students included Jill Morawski, who has gone on to a distinguished career at Wesleyan, and June Rogers, an older student, who invited us to her home in Rockcliffe, which made quite an impression on me, as I don't think I had ever been in such a lovely and spacious home. I've been fortunate to maintain contact with Jill, mostly when we happen to be at the same conference. But importantly, I continue to draw on her scholarship in my own work. Two guests also attended one of the seminars that year: Ian Lubeck, a young professor then from the University of Guelph, and Erika Apfelbaum from CNRS in Paris. They had contributed to the debates about the crisis in social psychology and were critical of celebratory histories of psychology that aimed to justify current practices based on the historical record. Today, I consider Ian to be a friend and colleague. Among other things, we have published together and most recently had overlapping visits to Massey University in New Zealand, which was completely unplanned. Just one of those nice, spontaneous things that happen sometimes. Unfortunately, I've not had the opportunity to meet Erika in person since the seminar, but one of my doctoral students, who was working on a project involving women in leadership positions, had the honor of meeting her in Paris and was able to discuss their mutual research interests. But for this chance meeting in Brian Laver's course, who knows if that conversation would have taken place. As a PhD student, I met Fran Cherry in her first year at Carleton through her course on the psychology of aggression. This was my first experience with an explicitly feminist professor who was also knowledgeable about race politics. Growing up in Calgary and now living in Ottawa in a very white environment, I had little exposure to racial discrimination up close. Fran sensitized me to issues of race, power, and gender, and has continued to make an impression on me through her subsequent work. The paper I wrote for her course, which I still remember, was actually my first piece of scholarship related to the psychology of gender. I completed a critical review of research on assertiveness training for women. At the time, there was a debate between those who saw assertiveness training as key in propelling women to positions of power and enabling their self-determination, and those who said, hey, wait a minute, when women behave just like assertive men, those women are not seen as assertive. Instead, they are seen as aggressive and provoke negative reactions. This debate engaged me, for I could see its personal relevance. Would my pathway to success involve my being a good girl, or would I have to man up? In the end, I think both have been true. And in fact, this topic continues to have currency today. I was also a TA for Bill Petrusek, who later introduced me to some of the basics of psychophysics. Although I don't quite remember exactly what my TA duties consisted of, or many specifics of psychophysics, which was no fault of Bill's, I must say. He was a very enthusiastic and knowledgeable professor. But I do remember many wonderful evenings at Bill and Elaine's, which invariably involved excellent food, good conversation, and Bob Dylan. The significance of these relationships are hard to gauge, but they remain memorable and clearly supported me through my graduate studies. For me, graduate school was a total immersion experience, very intense, and at times perhaps too consuming. Bill and Elaine offered some balance and respite from this, and these are particularly special memories. And last but not least, there was the Hypno Lab, which was my whole world for several years. As one of Nick Spanos' first students, I received a lot of attention and increasing responsibilities within the lab as I matured and the number of students increased. By the time I graduated, I had played a role in the supervision of honors and other graduate students, dealt with research budgets and research grant applications, and co-authored an impressive number of conference papers and journal articles. I had also met many of the leading figures in the field of hypnosis: Martin Orne, Ted Barber, Ted Sarbin, Bill Coe, and John Schaubs. Now, Nick had a tendency to divide the world into good guys and bad guys, with the inevitable effect that there was little possibility of dialogue. Nevertheless, the bad guys respected the research coming out of his lab, and as his student, they extended the same courtesy to me. For example, some years after graduation, Martin Orne, one of the bad guys, supported me for fellow status in the Society for Experimental and Clinical Hypnosis. Looking at the Hypno Lab through a gender lens, it was no feminist haven. But, I was given opportunities that I now realize prepared me well for an academic position and to negotiate the challenges of academic life. And the ever-critical project of taking on the state theorists thickened my skin and made me feel comfortable working on the margins of the discipline. I'm not sure if Nick would appreciate the irony of this, but I think he contributed to my evolution as a feminist psychologist. Other memories that I will note briefly include Bill Jones, who was a frequent presence in the Hypno Lab and in fact supervised one of my independent research projects. He was definitely a complicated man, but brilliant. Indeed, it feels rather odd to be here celebrating without Nick and Bill. And of course, there were other students. Most I have lost touch with, but a few I now regard as friends and colleagues. Lauren Bertrand, for one, still lives in Calgary and works at the Institute for Research on Law and the Family, and our current head of department is David Hodgins. So these are but two that I have kept in touch with. And last but not least, I remember the support staff. Talking with Lynn Giff and Jackie Kellogg last night reminded me that for graduate students, it was often safer to ask for assistance from staff than from faculty. And they were often more helpful, too, I might add. In closing, I'm reminded that we can tell multiple stories about our lives. The story of how Carleton enabled me to get an academic job when the market was sparse is a celebratory story, one that universities hope to hear. And I hope you heard it as an authentic story. Yet I was part of the cohort of women in the mid to late 20th century who increasingly moved into higher education, competing with their male colleagues for academic positions. Soon after I took up my position at Calgary, it became more usual to hire women faculty. So this is a second, I think, also authentic story, one of greater historical forces within which I and Canadian universities were caught up. But listening to John Barefoot today, talking about the history of social psychology in the department, when Lloyd Strickland was instrumental in bringing Soviet and North American psychologists into dialogue and bringing the crisis in social psychology to Carleton, and also thinking about John's course on the crisis in social psychology, my very first social psychology course, I might add, reminded me that there is a third authentic story to tell. This story is about the hidden curriculum I encountered in the Department of Psychology here at Carleton, an implicit curriculum about the importance of history, power, gender, and critical analysis of our discipline. In my case, I think I embodied this curriculum and consequently was prepared to turn to feminist psychology and qualitative methods as I encountered new academic situations. So, I would like to thank the department for both overt and hidden curricula. I think I've led a very privileged life, and it has been very lovely to participate in this event. Thank you.